My parents kicked me out so my pregnant sister could have my room now. They're calling daily because the one who never said no finally did. I'm a 27-year-old guy. I've always put my family first. Growing up, our house was small, tight, and always loud with tension. Mom worked long hours cleaning offices. Dad did odd jobs here and there, but the bills never seemed to stop coming. I learned early that if something went wrong, it was my responsibility to fix it or at least take the blame. I'd skip hanging out with friends, take extra shifts, or save my paycheck to cover utilities. My sister Sarah, meanwhile, floated through life like she had a permanent safety net. She got the newest phone every year, clothes I couldn't even dream of, and never seemed to hear the word no. Mom had a way of twisting gratitude into guilt. If it weren't for you, we'd never manage, she'd say, her eyes soft but sharp, a mix of praise and a reminder that I was always indebted. Dad, bless him, never spoke up. He'd nod, mutter something vague, and let Mom run the house with her rules. I tried to stay invisible when I could, because any hint of defiance felt like a betrayal, but invisible or not, I was always responsible for the household. If Sarah broke something or missed an allowance payment, somehow I was involved, blamed, or tasked with fixing it. Despite all this, I loved them. I loved my family more than I loved myself sometimes. I believed my sacrifices meant something, that the quiet labor behind the scenes was the glue holding us together. But lately, I've started noticing the subtle cracks, how my accomplishments went unnoticed, how Sarah's whims became priorities over mine. Even when I did something small for myself, it was met with a shrug or a well. That's nice. It's not that they didn't care. It's just that I was always expected to care more. I thought loyalty was enough, that love could protect me from resentment. But sometimes doing the right thing feels like slowly digging your own trap. And I have a creeping feeling that my family's definition of fair might not include me at all. It all started the day Sarah called us into the living room with this excited grin that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Mom, Dad, I have something to tell you," she said, bouncing on the balls of her feet like she'd been rehearsing this announcement for weeks. My parents leaned in, eyes bright, and I felt that familiar twist in my stomach, the feeling of being on the outside of something that wasn't meant for me. Then she said it. "I'm pregnant." Mom gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, and Dad blinked like he'd been hit with a sudden, incomprehensible reality. "Oh, honey," Mom whispered, "this is wonderful." Sarah's face lit up, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. And for a moment, I wanted to be genuinely happy for her. I really did. But the way my parents' eyes shifted toward her, the soft murmurs of "we'll need to make space, and you're going to need so much support," I felt that creeping sense of unease, like the rug beneath me had been pulled without warning. A week later, they started dropping subtle hints about the house adjustments we'd all need to make for the baby. "It's going to be a big change," Mom said casually one evening, while Dad just hummed, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe you could think about spending more time at your apartment, just to make things easier for Sarah." The words were polite, almost gentle, but I felt the punch behind them. My room, the one I'd kept spotless and organized, the one that had been my little corner of peace in a house that never stopped demanding, was suddenly a negotiable commodity. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I'd help because family comes first. But every time I saw Sarah gush over baby clothes, crib setups, and color-coordinated nursery plans, it felt like the first real crack in the foundation of my quiet loyalty. I realized then that this wasn't just about help. It was about expectation, about my role being rewritten without asking me. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the question, when does support become surrender? I tried to push it aside, but deep down, I knew something was about to shift and I wasn't sure I'd like the consequences. A few days after all the excitement died down, Mom pulled me aside in the kitchen while Sarah was busy scrolling through baby registries. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was steel underneath it. "We need to talk about your room," she said. And just like that, my stomach dropped. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. What about it? I asked, though part of me already knew what was coming. You'll need to move out, she said, as if stating the weather. Sarah needs the space for the baby, and it's time you let her have it. It's just for a while, of course. You'll understand it's what families do. I blinked. That was it. No discussion. No negotiation. Just an expectation wrapped in polite words. Mom, come on. I live here too. This is my room, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad hovered in the background, looking guilty but saying nothing. And Sarah peeked her head around the corner with that infuriating, innocent grin. You've always been the responsible one, Mom continued, softening her tone, and that's why we're asking you. This isn't a punishment, it's a contribution, a sacrifice for your sister. Every word felt like a dagger disguised in velvet. I swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of disbelief. The room I had made my sanctuary, the only place in that house where I felt I belonged, was suddenly being handed over without my consent. And the justification was my duty. I felt rage bubbling under my skin, mixed with a heavy ache of betrayal. I wanted to shout, to argue, to make them see how unfair this was, but the fear of upsetting Mom, and the knowledge that Dad would never step in, held me frozen. I nodded, even though my throat burned and my hands trembled. Okay, I said quietly, because that's what I'd always done. Comply, take the burden silently, and hope the world wouldn't crumble around me. But as I packed the first of my boxes, dragging my life into a small temporary apartment, a quiet, simmering anger started to grow inside me. I had a creeping suspicion that this sacrifice would cost more than I ever imagined on, that it might be the first step toward losing more than just my room. Packing up my things that weekend felt surreal, like I was slowly erasing myself from a home I'd built through years of quiet labor. Every shirt folded, every book stacked, every photo carefully wrapped reminded me that this was more than a room I was leaving a piece of my identity behind. The air smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon cleaner, a scent that had always been Mom's favorite for freshness. I paused for a moment, hands hovering over a stack of notebooks, memories flooding in, late-night study sessions at that desk, winter mornings waking to the smell of Dad's coffee, and Sarah sprawled on my bed scrolling her phone while I cleaned up after her messes. I tried to tell myself it was just temporary, that this move was a contribution, a demonstration of my loyalty. But loyalty has a funny way of feeling like surrender when no one asks if you're willing. The streets of the city felt colder as I lugged boxes to my tiny apartment, the echo of my footsteps in the stairwell emphasizing how alone I suddenly was. The space smelled like dust and paint, and the walls seemed to leer at me with stark, unwelcoming angles. I placed my box on the floor and sank onto a chair that didn't quite fit, feeling the weight of my choices press down like a physical force. That night I called Mom, more out of habit than need. Everything okay? She asked cheerfully, and I forced a smile I knew she couldn't see. Yeah, settling in, I said, my voice hollow. Her quick sigh of relief made my stomach twist. It wasn't concern, it was validation she'd gotten what she wanted, and I'd gone along quietly, like I always had. As I stared out the window at the dim glow of streetlights, I realized something unsettling. My absence didn't feel noticed. Sarah's excitement had taken center stage in the house, and my parents seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by my presence. I had thought leaving would give me peace, that stepping back might let me breathe. But the more I watched, the lights flicker in the apartments across the street, the more I wondered if I'd been cast out of a family that only valued me as long as I sacrificed silently and in the quiet. I felt it the first twinge of resentment, small and dangerous. Creeping in, living on my own, was both freeing and terrifying. My apartment was tiny, barely enough space for my bed, a small kitchen table, and the boxes I hadn't unpacked. The first few nights, I lay on the stiff mattress, listening to the hum of the street outside. The occasional car horn, the distant laughter from neighbors' windows. It was quiet in a way that made my own thoughts echo, and I realized how much noise and chaos I had carried inside me all those years. I didn't miss the arguments or the guilt trips, but I missed feeling like I mattered. For the first time, it hit me how invisible I'd been in my own home. Asterisk, I threw myself into work to distract myself from the silence. Early mornings, late nights, picking up extra shifts, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to the house I'd left behind. Cooking for myself became a small victory. I made something other than instant noodles, set the table just for me, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pride. But every time I checked my phone, waiting for a text or a call from Mom, I felt a hollow pang of disappointment. She didn't ask how I was doing, didn't acknowledge that I'd just uprooted my life to help them. And then came the first call from Mom, cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened. "How's the apartment? You're adjusting okay?" she asked. I forced a smile I knew she couldn't see. "Yeah, it's fine," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. After hanging up, I sat back and realized it wasn't concern, it was performance. A check-in to make sure I hadn't rebelled or refused their plan. And yet, I found myself replaying our conversations, wondering if I'd been overreacting, if I'd misunderstood their intentions. But deep down, I knew the truth. The sacrifices I'd made for years covering bills, helping Sarah, holding up the household were invisible until I wasn't there. Suddenly, the apartment felt smaller than ever, a mirror for the emptiness I hadn't allowed myself to notice. And in that quiet loneliness, thoughts settled into my chest like a stone. Maybe leaving wasn't just a move, that it was the first step toward reclaiming myself. Yet, just as I began to feel that spark of control, a subtle tension lingered, whispering that the hardest part of this ordeal was still to come. About a month into living alone, I got a call from Mom that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. "Sarah's not doing well," she said, her voice sharp at first, then softening like she was testing the waters. "She's having some complications. It's been rough. We could really use your help." My stomach twisted. For weeks, I had been adjusting to life outside their house, learning to breathe without the constant weight of their expectations. And now, suddenly, they wanted me back, but not because they missed me. I asked for details, trying to mask the irritation in my voice. Dad sounded tired on the line, quiet and distant. Sarah's been having hospital visits, emotional breakdowns. Mood swings. They painted this picture of total helplessness. And in the background, I could hear Sarah crying softly, probably rehearsing her lines for the guilt I was about to feel. The thing is, they had never called like this before. Not when she missed bills, not when she caused fights at home, not when Dad struggled with work. Only after I'd moved out did suddenly every crisis seem urgent. I remember pacing my apartment, listening to the faint hum of the heater, and feeling the old ache return, the one I had buried under work and independence. I wanted to help. Part of me always would. But another part, the one that had been quiet for too long, screamed that this wasn't real concern, was manipulation. They wanted me to return to shoulder responsibilities I'd spent my life carrying quietly, now framed as a moral obligation. Sarah's voice crackled over the line, sweet and soft. I really need you, please." My throat tightened. I could almost feel the house behind her, the crib they'd assembled. The walls painted in soft pastels, the way my old room had already been claimed. And I realized in that instant that everything had shifted. My absence had revealed their need for me in a way that made me angry, but also painfully aware of my power. I told them I'd think about it. But deep down I knew this was the crossroads. Would I let them guilt me back into the cage I had just left? Or would I finally draw a line, no matter the cost? A few days after Mom's call, I finally answered the phone again, knowing the conversation could change everything. "I can't keep running back and forth, Mom," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I have my own life here." Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "You don't understand," she said, her tone shifting between panic and accusation. "Sarah is your sister. She's carrying a child. She needs you." "I get that," I replied, my chest tightening. "I've helped her my whole life. But moving back in, giving up my space, my peace, it's not fair. I'm not the only one responsible for this family." Dad muttered something low in the background, a mumble that barely counted as support. Sarah's voice came in softly, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for things to get so hard." Her words made my stomach twist, guilt creeping in despite my anger. Mom's voice rose, dripping with manipulation. After everything you've been given, everything we've sacrificed for you, you'd deny your own family? I gritted my teeth, sensing the trap. They weren't asking, they were demanding. And for the first time, I realized how often my compliance had been expected rather than appreciated. Mom, I love you all, but love isn't about surrendering myself every time it's convenient for you, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She gasped, stunned. Dad didn't know where to look. Sarah went quiet. I felt a strange thrill at finally speaking my truth, even though it scared me. I could hear their disappointment like a heavy weight pressing down through the phone. They tried guilt, fear, subtle threats. Comparisons to what a good son brother should do, but I didn't flinch. I hung up feeling a mix of relief and dread. Relief because I had finally stood up for myself, but dread because I knew this would change everything at home. The calls wouldn't stop. They'd escalate. The guilt trips, the manipulations. The subtle jabs, they were just beginning, and as I stared out the window at the city lights, I felt it. This confrontation was only the first round. The real battle for respect, for boundaries, for my sanity, was still ahead. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for the storm they were about to bring. The days that followed were worse than I imagined. My phone wouldn't stop ringing, Mom, Dad, even Sarah calling at odd hours. Each conversation a mix of guilt, panic, and veiled blame. You're leaving us to handle this alone, Mom, said one night, her voice trembling in a way that was supposed to tug at my heart. I thought you cared about family. My hands shook as I put the phone down, the apartment suddenly feeling smaller than ever. The quiet I had once cherished now felt suffocating, echoing the emptiness I had tried to fill with work and independence. Friends invited me out, offered distractions, but I couldn't shake the weight pressing on my chest. Every time I sat down to cook, clean, or even watch TV, my mind drifted back to the house I'd left, the laughter that wasn't mine. The tiny victories that went unnoticed, the way Sarah got away with everything. Even my own achievements, paying bills, covering hospital visits, managing responsibilities, felt invisible. Like I was a ghost who only existed when someone needed something. Then came the text from a distant relative. Your parents are worried you're abandoning the family. They don't know what they'll do without you. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just Mom and Dad anymore. People I barely spoke to were weighing in, reinforcing the narrative I was the problem. I felt trapped in an invisible web, every thread tugging at my self-esteem. Every reminder that no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed. The faint hum of the heater my only company. I pressed my face into my hands and let the tears come hot and heavy, carrying months' years of unacknowledged sacrifices. I questioned everything. Had I been wrong to hope for independence? Had I misread their love all along? The anger I had felt during our confrontation turned inward, a sharp, biting ache. For the first time, I felt utterly alone. The family I had given everything to seemed unreachable, and I wondered if I'd ever find a place where my loyalty wasn't just expected but valued. And as I stared into the darkness, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't keep running from this. Something had to change, or I'd lose myself completely. The morning after that night of tears, something shifted. I woke up with a tightness in my chest that wasn't just sadness, it was clarity. I couldn't go on being everyone's safety net while being invisible, guilted, and drained. I realized that their constant calls, their manipulations, their subtle digs, they only worked because I had let them. If I didn't set boundaries now, I'd never feel free, never reclaim the space and respect I had earned. I started small. I didn't answer every call. I let a few texts sit unread while I focused on myself. When Mom called again, I answered calmly, without panic or guilt. I can't do everything for you, I said, carefully choosing my words. I've done what I could, but I have to live my life too. There was a pause on the other end, a quiet that felt heavier than any yelling ever could. I also began keeping track of interactions, jotting down calls, requests, and guilt trips. It was strange at first, like cataloging all the ways I had been manipulated, but seeing it on paper made it real. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't normal. I realized I had power here, power I hadn't exercised, because I was too conditioned to comply then. Small victories appeared. A call would come, and I'd respond, without giving in to every demand. I would politely redirect Sarah's pleas back to her parents instead of stepping in immediately. Each time I did, I felt a tiny spark of pride. For the first time in years, I was learning to hold my ground, and it felt almost intoxicating. Yet even as I celebrated these small wins, I knew the storm wasn't over. Mom's subtle threats, Dad's silence, Sarah's pleading, they were all part of a system designed to wear me down. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had a plan forming in my mind, a strategy to reclaim control without losing myself in their chaos. And deep down I knew one day they would realize I was no longer theirs to command. By now, the calls had become relentless, almost a daily ritual. Mom would ring first thing in the morning, then Dad in the afternoon, sometimes even Sarah late at night. "We really need you to check in. It's important," Mom said one morning, her voice sweet but layered with urgency. "I just want to know you're still there for us." I stared at my phone for a moment, heart pounding, before taking a deep breath and replying calmly, "I'm here, but I can't drop everything every time something comes up. You know I've always helped, but I have to live my life too." It was ironic. This was the one thing I had never done before. The one time I actually said no, I could hear the panic in their voices, the subtle tension in every word. Dad stuttered over his response, muttering about obligations and responsibility, while Mom tried to guilt me into coming back home. Sarah, who had never been the one to assert herself, sounded almost desperate. I don't know how to do this alone." I felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction, anger, and a strange thrill. For the first time, the tables had turned. The people who had always demanded my obedience were now realizing that I wasn't theirs to control. Every call that came, every plea they made, was a test I was no longer willing to fail. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give in. I simply reminded them of boundaries, calmly, firmly, and with a quiet confidence that had been missing for years. Still, the calls kept coming. Each one a subtle battle, a challenge to my resolve. I could feel my patience being tested, my anger simmering beneath the surface. And yet, there was a strange satisfaction in knowing that I had finally found a way to assert myself, that I had finally become the person they could no longer manipulate. As I hung up after another call, staring at the muted city lights through my window, I realized something. The real confrontation was coming. And this time, I wouldn't be backing down. It all came to a head one evening when I finally decided I couldn't keep deflecting. I called Mom and Dad together, telling them I needed to speak honestly. "This isn't working," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I can't keep being treated like I owe you my life just because I've always done the right thing. I'm done being guilt-tripped, manipulated, and expected to sacrifice endlessly." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear Dad shifting uncomfortably, Mom drawing in a sharp breath, and then Sarah's hesitant voice. I didn't mean to make things so hard. It was the first time any of them admitted without anger or blame that their actions had consequences beyond what they intended. I felt a surge of strength. "You've relied on me for everything for years, and I let it happen because I thought love meant compliance," I said. "But love isn't supposed to feel like a chain." Mom tried to counter with her usual mix of guilt and flattery, but I cut her off gently, firmly. "I appreciate what you've done for me, but I won't let that be used to control me. If you want my help, it will be on terms that respect me. I'm not just a resource for your comfort anymore." The tension on the line was palpable. Dad finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost ashamed. I guess we didn't realize." Sarah was silent, probably processing that I wasn't going to be the safety net she had depended on. For the first time, the family hierarchy felt reversed. My boundaries weren't just being acknowledged. They were forcing change. When I hung up, I felt an unfamiliar weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't fought. I had simply taken a stand. And even though I knew there would be fallout, continued calls, and perhaps even anger, I felt empowered in a way I never had before. They had finally seen that I wasn't theirs to command, and I didn't have to apologize for taking my place in my own life. But even as I sat back, exhausted yet resolute, I knew the final chapter was still ahead. The real payoff, the moment where everything would finally settle, was yet to come. It took a few weeks, but things finally began to shift. The daily calls slowed, their tones softening from guilt trips to genuine check-ins. Mom still called to ask advice. Dad still asked for updates. But now, there was respect in their voices. No longer was I a servant to their whims. I was finally being treated like a person whose feelings and boundaries mattered. Sarah, too, seemed to understand. She stopped asking for favors the moment she wanted them, and for the first time, I saw her make her own mistakes, learn her own lessons, and take responsibility. I started to feel lighter, like a weight I hadn't realized I carried for decades had been lifted. My apartment no longer felt cramped. It felt like home. I cooked for myself, decorated the walls with the little things I loved, and allowed myself to take time for hobbies and friends I had long neglected. Every small choice reminded me that I was capable of living on my own terms, that I didn't need permission to exist fully. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. Mom called one evening, her voice quiet. "We've realized. We may have pushed you too far. We didn't know what we were asking, and we're sorry." Dad echoed it in a low, hesitant tone. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. They had finally acknowledged the imbalance, finally understood that my compliance had limits. I didn't gloat. I didn't even gloat inwardly. I just listened, knowing I had earned my peace. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure. I had stood up for myself, claimed my space, and rebuilt my relationship with my family on terms that respected me. I didn't need revenge or confrontation anymore. The empowerment came from knowing that I had survived the storm, that I had finally put myself first without guilt. Sitting by my window that night, looking at the quiet glow of the city lights, I realized something profound. The one who had always said yes had finally said no to their control, to their manipulation, and to the unfair rules of a family that only now was learning to see me as equal. And for the first time, I felt free.